The Nintendo Switch 2 launched earlier this year, and along with new games, we're now able to play a large number of Switch 1 games at higher resolutions and frame rates, among other things. With the Switch 2's enhanced processing power, a lot of these games are just so much better now, including a large group of Sonic games. A total of 9 Sonic games were released on Switch 1, and so far, 2 of those have gotten dedicated Switch 2 versions. But as it turns out, even without a dedicated Switch 2 release, the Sonic games released on Switch 1 still benefit from the Switch 2's hardware upgrade with backwards compatibility. So f*** it. Let's take a look at every Sonic game released on Switch 1 and see how Switch 2 improves upon it. But before getting into this, I want to go over how I'm testing each game. Every game will be tested in docked mode. As you may already know, load times, performance, and resolution may vary depending on whether you're playing in docked or handheld mode. Load times may also be slightly different depending on whether you play on a physical copy as opposed to a digital copy. For some of these games, I own them physically, but for others, I own them digitally. So just keep in mind that you may see some very slight differences based on that. But with that out of the way, let's get started. Starting with Sonic Mania, released in 2017. Now, clearly this is not the most graphically intensive game. In fact, this game already ran pretty flawlessly on Switch 1 at 1080p 60 FPS, so it was no surprise to find out that this game has no difference on Switch 2. The graphics are identical, performance is the same, and even the load times are pretty much on par with the Switch 1. Maybe the Switch 2 loads ever so slightly faster, but only by a second or two. The game is still perfectly playable on Switch 2, but it's also damn near perfect on Switch 1. Again, I wasn't expecting too much here. So let's move on to Sonic Forces, also released in 2017. Okay, now we have some actual differences, both good and bad. On Switch 1, Forces ran at 720p 30 FPS, which for this game is passable. On Switch 2, the game also runs at that same resolution and frame rate, so no differences there. Load times, however, are significantly improved. I used the load into Mortar Canyon as an example. On Switch 1, the load took around 9 seconds, but on Switch 2, that time was cut down to 4 seconds. So a significant difference there. But unfortunately, the Switch 2 also has a downgrade. This could just be me, but I noticed some weird input delay when playing on Switch 2. It made the game feel a lot stiffer, and for a platformer like this, that's not a good thing. I honestly don't know why this happens, so if anybody has a good idea, then please let me know. On to Team Sonic Racing, released in 2019. Yeah, remember this game? In my opinion, it's one of the most boring and generic Sonic racing games, and I bought it on Switch just for this video, so you're welcome. On Switch 1, the game displayed a 900p resolution, with performance targeting 30 FPS. On Switch 2, that still remains. However, I did notice that the Switch 2's enhanced processing power kept it at a much more stable 30 FPS, whereas on Switch 1, the game had multiple frame drops. So the improvement is nice. Load times have been drastically improved. On Switch 1, the load into the first Grand Prix was around 25 seconds. Yikes. But on Switch 2, that was chopped down to only 13 seconds, which in all honesty is still a bit long, but at the end of the day, an improvement is an improvement. But yeah, it's still Team Sonic Racing through and through. I wouldn't recommend this game at all, unless you're just curious or something. Just go play CrossWorlds or Mario Kart instead. Then we have Sonic Colors Ultimate, released in 2021. Alright, I'm just going to save you some time here. Yes, you guessed right, the game has identical graphics and better load times on Switch 2. Just kidding. Both of those things are actually false. The load times are weirdly the same. The Switch 2's better processing doesn't do anything to improve load times in the game. It's almost as if these loading screens are artificial in a way, like they show up for a set time just to ensure that everything loads. It's not an actual loading screen. But I don't know how any of that actually works, so I'm just talking out of my ass here. And to my surprise, there are actually some good graphical improvements. This shot of Sweet Mountain is a great demonstration. The Switch 2 provides a lot more clarity to the textures and objects. There's a lot more detail in things like the clouds in the background and the sun rays. I was actually shocked seeing this because this game doesn't have a dedicated Switch 2 version. So how are these improvements even possible? Well, as it turns out, the Switch 1 version used dynamic resolution scaling, meaning that to maintain performance, the resolution and level of detail would fluctuate between 720p and 1080p. Yes, this was needed for a remaster of a f***ing Wii game. But thankfully, since the Switch 2's hardware can maintain that stable frame rate, this feature is not needed, allowing the game to run at a consistent 1080p, as opposed to the Switch 1 running the game at around 720p. So that explains the improved detail. It's actually really cool. I just don't understand the loading screen thing, that's still pretty weird. Oh, and also, the input delay is back. Yay. So playing this game on Switch 2 will give you both upgrades and downgrades. It's honestly pretty fitting for Colors Ultimate. Now for Sonic Origins, released in 2022. You're not going to fucking believe this, but there are no differences between the Switch 1 and Switch 2. Sonic Origins on Switch 1 was already pretty damn flawless. It's basically the same situation as Mania. These games aren't graphically demanding, so naturally they could run on low-end hardware pretty well. I would have still liked to see some improvements to the island menus, as those are still capped at a lower frame rate and lower resolution. But since they're just menus, it's not a huge deal. So let's just jump to Sonic Frontiers, also released in 2022. Yeah, this one was rough on Switch 1. It did its best to target 30 FPS, but in order to reach that, they had to compress nearly everything, including a resolution set to less than 720p. And it just does not look good, man. I was really hoping for a Colors Ultimate situation here, but no, the graphics look nearly identical on Switch 2. I only noticed a slight, and I mean slight, bump in clarity, but that could honestly just be my eyes playing tricks on me. And it's probably not even noticeable in the video. The frame rate is still capped to 30 FPS, but with the Switch 2's enhanced processing, it maintains a much more stable 30 FPS, which is an improvement over the Switch 1 having a few frame dips in certain areas. Apart from that, the only drastic thing here is the difference in load times. I tested 3 different loading scenarios here. The first cutscene load to cyberspace at the beginning of the game clocked in at around 5 seconds on Switch 1 and 2 seconds on Switch 2. Not too big of a difference. The load to the first open zone area, however, was a 10-second difference, with the Switch 1 clocking at 17 seconds and the Switch 2 was 7 seconds. I tested one more scenario going back into cyberspace, and there was not a huge difference there. So while there is a huge difference in some areas, the load times as a whole are not that different, all things considered. At least that's what I've gathered. I really hope that they eventually release a Switch 2 edition for this game, or at least a patch that gives us a better resolution and better performance, because this just isn't going to cut it, man. Now onto Sonic Superstars, released in 2023. There's not much to say here either. Superstars actually had one of the better Switch 1 ports. The level of detail was significantly lower compared to other platforms, but I think it actually gave the game some charm, and I think it was totally worth it to get that 60 FPS frame rate. It is great. And all of that remains on Switch 2, with the only difference being, you guessed it, the load times. They're basically cut in half. On Switch 1, I timed 14 seconds, and on Switch 2, I timed 7 seconds. Superstars is still more than playable on Switch 2 though. But now we're finally getting to the good stuff. Let's talk about Sonic X Shadow Generations, which got a dedicated Switch 2 release in 2025 with improved visuals and performance. Sounds great on paper, but in execution, this port feels super lazy. Okay, the Sonic Generation side of things has really been improved. On Switch 1, the game ran at 1080p 31 FPS. Yes, that's not a mistake. For some reason, the game is capped at 31 FPS, which actually makes it look worse than 30 FPS due to the frame rate not evenly matching up with pretty much any standard refresh rate, causing some weird frame pacing issues. I think this was just an accident, but it did suck. So thankfully, the Switch 2 version now runs the game at 1440p 60 FPS, and my god, it's a dream. It doesn't really get any better than this. There doesn't seem to be any significant trade-off either. It looks pretty on par with how I play the game on PC. Load times are practically identical. I only counted a 1 or 2 second difference. It turns out that the game already loaded pretty damn fast on Switch 1. But yeah, Sonic Generations on Switch 2 is fantastic. The real laziness starts to show when we move over to Shadow Generations. Now, being a more modern Sonic game, obviously it's not going to be as easy to hit something like 1440p 60 FPS. But it definitely should be possible, right? Well, I guess we'll never know, because the Switch 2 version of Shadow Generations only runs the game at 720p 60 FPS in performance mode and 1080p 30 FPS in quality mode. It is an improvement, as the Switch 1 version targeted 720p 30 FPS, but it used dynamic resolution scaling to maintain that frame rate, so the resolution often dropped lower. On Switch 2, we get a stable 720p. But come on, you're really telling me they couldn't have at least done 1080p? The performance mode also has these weird artifacts, like on Shadow's Eye here. It looks kind of smudged in a way. It just doesn't look right. Load times have also been improved slightly, but yeah, this port is just kind of there. I would not recommend double dipping and buying this game again to get these improvements. Oh yeah, I almost forgot to mention, there's no upgrade path for the Switch 2 version of the game. So if you have a Switch 1 copy and want to play with these improvements, you gotta pay another $50. But it does go on sale a lot, so there's that. Last but certainly not least, we have Sonic Racing CrossWorlds, released earlier this year. And at the time I'm writing this video, the game actually got a Switch 2 edition today. Yeah, they took some extra time to polish things up here, which I can definitely appreciate since again, that last port was not very impressive. And holy shit, the wait definitely paid off here. On Switch 1, this game targeted 720p 30 FPS, which looked pretty bad, yeah. But on Switch 2, it runs at 1440p 60 FPS with really no major setbacks. And it's fantastic. Testing it side by side, it looks pretty on par with how I run the game on PC at high settings. The only notable differences are that on PC, there are more detailed reflections and more bloom. Switch 2 also has better load times than Switch 1 by around 5 seconds. I know, right? Shocker. When you look at how the Switch 2 lets you play the game on the go, on top of how good the game runs, I would honestly recommend this version over any other version of the game. Oh, and guess what? This is an actual Switch 2 edition game, meaning that there is a $10 upgrade path. So if you already got the Switch 1 version, then you can just upgrade to the Switch 2 version without buying the whole damn game again. CrossWorlds is fantastic on Switch 2. So there you have it. That's every Sonic game released on Switch 1 tested on Switch 2. Yeah, only a couple of games have drastic differences, but I'm still a bit shocked by how many games actually benefit from being played on Switch 2. Hopefully in the near future, more of these games will get dedicated Switch 2 versions. But as they are now, all of them are more than playable. Except for Forces, of course, that game is fucking dog shit. But yeah, that's all for me. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all later. Goodbye.